I have the pleasure today of introducing Dr. Elizabeth Beth Kelley. Dr. Kelley is an associate professor in psychology and psychiatry and a member of the Center for Neuroscience Studies at Queen's University. She completed her undergraduate degree in psychology at York University in 2000 and received her PhD in developmental psychology from the University of Connecticut in 2006. Dr. Kelley has a wide range of research interests related to both typical and atypical child development and has published in a number of prestigious journals, including Child Development, Current Directions in Psychological Science, and Nature. Dr. Kelley has been funded by the National Institutes of Health, by the Canadian Institutes for Health Research and Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and many other funding agencies. Welcome, Dr. Kelley, and we look forward to hearing your presentation today.
So thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to discussing with you some of the programs that are available for young children with autism. Please note, as Anna mentioned, I will be using person first language, that is children with autism, throughout this talk, as that is what the latest research suggests that parents tend to prefer. And I know that we've got a number of parents in the audience. I do generally use identity first language, that is autistic child, when speaking to autistic people themselves, or in my publications, as that is what autistic advocates and adults tend to prefer. And just another reminder, don't forget to use the question and answer function if you have any questions. So the question and answer function should be either at the top or the bottom of your screen, depending on your layout. And Anna will read them out to me at the end of the session, and she will not read out any names, so don't worry about that. Okay, so today I will be talking a little bit about what early intervention is and why it's important. I'll go very briefly over the history of interventions that have been used with children with autism. Note that I use the term intervention rather than the term treatment, as people with autism prefer this term. Remember, what we are doing with our interventions is not trying to cure the person with autism, but rather we're trying to provide them with the tools to successfully adapt to living in a neurotypical world. So, and then I'll go into naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions in a little more detail, because that tends to be what's available to folks in Canada, as well as other places in the world, and are the more recent interventions. Some of the questions that were posed beforehand expressed interest in alternative interventions, so I will also discuss those. And then I'll discuss a bit about, as a field, where we need to go from here. So the first thing I will talk about is what exactly is early intervention. So early intervention is an umbrella term used for intervention that's performed with young children. Somebody asked ahead of time what that age range is, and some folks say before the age of 3. In Ontario, I know that's what the cutoff is for early intervention. Some folks say before the age of 5. It really depends on who you talk to. In Ontario, we use the term to cover up to the age of 4, 4 years and 0 months. So I wrote from 1 year of age on, as autism is not reliably diagnosed before the age of 18 months, although some children may get a diagnosis earlier than that, particularly if they're the sibling of a young child with autism. As parents may be more aware of the early symptoms and may be more concerned, since there is a genetic predisposition if you already have a child with autism. Some places or research centers, particularly in the States, will provide intervention for children suspected of having autism or at high risk for autism because they have an older sibling with autism. But in most areas, and particularly in Canada, you need to have a diagnosis before you're able to access any autism-specific services. Between the ages of 2 and 4, the brain undergoes an enormous amount of growth and reorganization. And for this reason, it's thought that intervention is most effective before the age of 4. Age may be even more important than the amount of intervention given or the type of intervention given. But however, I just want to reassure you, those of you who are parents, if you're still waiting for a diagnosis or you're still waiting for services, please don't despair. It's never too late for your child to start intervention. Although naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions have the most evidence behind them for success, there are children who do not respond well to these interventions. Indeed, one study recently found that children with higher support needs or lower IQ may respond better to discrete trial training, which is a type of ABA, and I'll talk a little more about this later. Unfortunately, it is often the case that sort of the rich get richer, that is, children who start off with lower support needs and higher IQ respond better to intervention overall. However, there's much that we don't know about exactly what factors predict response to intervention. And for any given program, unfortunately, the studies investigating these programs are often too small to statistically reliably predict factors that lead to better response to the interventions. So next, I'll talk a little bit about the history of interventions in autism. Autism, as you probably know, was first coined as a diagnostic term by Leo Kanner in 1943. And for many years, children with autism were simply institutionalized as a matter of course, and not a lot of intervention was given. My graduate advisor, who's a fair bit older than I am, used to tell stories of trying to do Freudian therapy with children in institutions, which was next to impossible since many of those children were not verbal or minimally speaking. And any of you that know anything about psychotherapy, is it involves a lot of talking. So as the deinstitutionalization movement started in the 1960s, clinicians started to try to work, use whatever seemed to work with the individual child, with a primary focus on trying to improve their language, as language difficulties were thought to be sort of the primary difficulty back then. And in the 1970s, the field moved towards behavioral treatments. Those treatments are variously known as ABA, or Applied Behavior Analysis, IBI, or Intensive Behavioral Intervention, or DTT, which is Discrete Trial Training. There are some nuanced differences between these three, but they're not so important for our discussion here, so I won't go into them. All three focused on using the principles of behavioral reinforcement and unfortunately punishment in the early days to increase behaviors that were shaped by the clinician. So, for example, to work on language, they would at first reinforce or reward any vocalization, and then slowly the clinician would become more and more sort of picky about what they would reinforce for the child's learning to say the word dog. So at first they would reinforce just any sound whatsoever. Then they would try to shape, the first sound, the D sound, and then dog, continuously rewarding anything that was getting closer and closer to that word. So these behavioral interventions were criticized for the cost. They seemed to need 40 hours of treatment per week by a trained clinician. So training the clinicians costs money, and then providing 40 hours a week costs money. There was a lack of flexibility, so they created very specific programs to work on. And in some cases, not much thought was given to what the child needed or what the family wanted for the child. There was a real lack of generalization of skills. So oftentimes the clinician would either work in the center or work in the child's home at a table with no distractions, and the child might learn, the words or whatever they were working on at the time at that table, but would not be able to do it in other situations. And also, there was no tie to theories of how children learn about the world. So it was, it did have the behavioral theory behind it, but it didn't really explain how kids learn and why kids learn, and thus was thought to be not a good way to teach children how to learn. So researchers in the treatment field started to address these various criticisms until naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions were born in the late 1980s with the Early Start Denver model. That was really the first model that was a naturalistic developmental behavioral intervention. But they didn't really catch on until like the late 1990s or early 2000s. So I'll now describe what naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions are, and describe 4 of them in a little bit more detail. I will be referring to these interventions as NDBIs for the remainder of the talk. So unlike behavioral interventions, which focused on behavioral theory rather than developmental theory, NDBIs use 3 prominent developmental theorists as their basis, in addition to behavioral theory. So, for example, Piaget saw the child as like a little scientist that was out there experimenting on their world. And thus, NDBIs try to keep in mind that the child is always trying to learn about their environment. Vygotsky stressed the importance of learning from other people, and so NDBIs really focus on that learning relationship with either the caregiver or the clinician, depending on the situation. And finally, Bruner talked about the fact that very young children learn a lot of language and communication from games and routines. If any of you have had young children, and I'm sure many of you have, you do the bedtime routine, you sort of say the same things every night when you're tucking the child in. You do the bath time routine, you say the same sort of things every time you give the child a bath. And so Bruner really thought that a lot of language was learned in those situations. So like that, like Bruner's theory, NDBI is trying to focus on learning language in routines. NDBIs are definitely better for children under 3 than traditional behavioral intervention, as they don't involve children just sitting at a table running trial after trial on the same thing. Because that's very difficult for children to do under the age of 3. However, like behavioral therapies, the learning environment should be relatively free from distraction so that the child can focus on what it is to be learned. Also, unlike many traditional forms of ABA, which focus primarily on learning language, NDBIs focus on engaging socially in a communicative way with either the clinician or the caregiver, depending on who is the primary interventionist, believing that once the child understands this person as a person they can communicate with, the language will come more readily. NDBIs have been tested in many different settings, and although there was some concern at first that some parents might find the administration of the intervention difficult, they seem to work for families of many different ethnicities, levels of education, and many different socioeconomic statuses. So that's a real plus for them. Caregiver responsiveness is really the key in parent-mediated interventions. So you can have either clinician-mediated interventions, as I've sort of alluded to, or parent-mediated interventions. In Ontario, for early intervention, you're only going to get parent-mediated intervention, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So although many of these interventions started out being provided by a trained clinician, researchers soon realized that involving parents was critical, as parents spend so much more time with their children and can engage in learning opportunities in many different situations to allow for generalization. So, you know, they can do it while they're getting ready for bed. They can do it in the supermarket. They can do it at the kitchen table. They can do it all over the place. So that's really important, that generalization piece. So some of the key constructs for NDBIs are that the parent follows the child's lead. So unlike traditional ABA or other behavioral therapies where the clinician was actually directing the child as to what they wanted to learn, in NDBIs, the clinician or the caregiver really pays attention to what the child is interested in and follows their lead. So they're starting off, you know, with that Piagetian, oh, the kid must want to learn about this thing, so let's learn about this thing. The NDBIs also work by modeling behaviors, so parents should model behaviors that are appropriate. They also have the parents or the clinician expand on communication. So if the child says dog, for example, the parent should always say, yes, that's a brown dog. You like dogs, you know, saying lots of words to add on to the child's vocabulary. Excuse me. They also work by increasing motivation. So increasing motivation to engage with the caregiver or the clinician by providing a positive learning environment. And part of that positive learning environment is the clinician or the caregiver is to provide lots of positive affect or emotion. Traditional behavioral therapies had the therapist as being somewhat neutral and only providing positive affect when the child was doing exactly what they wanted to do. Well, NDBIs focus on having more positive affects throughout the learning session. And they do engage in reinforcement or reward, but they want to use more natural reinforcements or rewards. So traditional behavioral therapies would say give the child, you know, half an M&M or a Skittle or something every time they did something that they wanted to do. What does a Skittle have to do with learning the word dog? Nothing. So in NDBIs, you really use the child's motivation for playing with a particular toy to teach the child the word for that toy, and then give the child the toy when they are getting closer to the word. So I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about 4 fairly well-known and widespread NDBIs. I put the social ABCs first because it's the only Canadian program fully created by Canadians, Susan Bryson at Dalhousie and Jessica Bryan at U of T. It's also the only one that was designed specifically for parent-mediated mediation rather than being designed for clinician mediation and then switching to parent mediation later. It's designed for 1 to 3-year-olds. When I say parent mediated, I mean that the parent is doing the majority of work with the child, although they do have support from trained clinicians in most cases. And certainly they do in Ontario in the program that is the social ABCs. So they start by having the clinician come in and spend time with the family to sort of discover what play and what routines children find most motivating and most rewarding. And then they work on a program with the parents to use these situations to increase communication and positive emotion sharing. CERTS is the next one I'll talk about, and that was created by Amy Weatherby and Barry Prezant, and it stands for Social Communication, Emotion Regulation, and Transactional Support. Transactional support is really just support for engaging with other people. So they really focus on teaching joint attention and symbolic behavior. And symbolic behavior can mean anything from language to pretend play. They use these two things to increase social communication, as they believe that once the child is able to effectively communicate, that temper tantrums or meltdowns will stop. And indeed, the research has shown that they do decrease significantly once children are able to make their needs known. The really nice thing about CERTS is that it actually continues into early childhood, although that's not currently done in Ontario. Jasper was created by Connie Kasari at UCLA, and this program stands for Joint Attention, Symbolic Play, Engagement, and regulation. So emotional regulation or controlling one's emotions. The 4 components of Jasper are environmental arrangement. So arranging like the materials that you want to use to teach the child at the child's eye level, making sure that you're down on the floor with the child or close to the child at their eye level so they can easily communicate with you. Mirrored pacing. So again, this idea of following the child's lead is very, very important, and sort of mirroring what they do. Prompting. So prompting is always prompting for communication, no matter what the child's level. So this can also be prompting for communication with assisted communicative devices, as well as verbal language. And sorry, I lost my place there. And communication. Communication. So again, encouraging all forms of communication, including nonverbal communication. So things like eye contact and joint attention and gestures and so forth. Pivotal response training is the last one that I will discuss here, and not everyone considers this to be an NDBI because it is a little more behaviorally focused than the other NDBIs. It was created by Robert and Lynn Kogel and is based more on ABA, but focuses on teaching what they call pivotal skills using natural reinforcement, unlike ABA. So pivotal skills include things like the motivation to interact with others, responding to multiple cues, so learning both verbal and nonverbal means of communication, self-management or emotion regulation, and initiation of social interactions. So all of these NDBIs, I know we probably have some people from across Canada. Every province has different intervention programs. So I'm only familiar with Ontario, and I didn't have time to look into all the different ones. I didn't know how many people would be from different provinces. So I apologize to those from different provinces. that I won't be talking about your province. But all of these NDBIs are part of the caregiver-mediated early years programs that are available to any child with an autism diagnosis in Ontario, age 1 to 3. Availability of a certain program may depend on your location, but all 4 of these have a good evidence base. And there are a couple others that are also available that are not as widespread, so I didn't go into them here. Okay, so now I'm going to give a little bit of discussion about alternative interventions. I want to give the disclaimer that this area is not my specialty at all. And so I am presenting here from things that I've read over the years, but primarily from a few recent review papers and meta-analyses, which are papers that take a whole bunch of studies and look at statistically how effective those studies are combined. I would never recommend that you use any of these therapies instead of ABA or an NDBI, but they can be used with some exceptions, which I'll talk about, in addition to these therapies. I only speak of them here because I know many parents are interested in them. Unfortunately, there's little evidence that any of them work for the majority of children with autism, but some of them may offer some help for some children. So if you're interested in one that is not listed here, please ask your family doctor or other service provider for safety information before engaging in any of these interventions. Unfortunately, there are some interventions out there that are not safe. So neuromodulation is, excuse me, one that I was asked about beforehand. And this is another word for brain stimulation, which is done basically by running an electric current through the scalp. And you may say, well, isn't that what ECG does? Unlike ECG, this current is focused on particular areas of the brain. So ECG actually covers the entire brain, but brain stimulation just covers a very specific area. In autism, they usually cover those that are responsible for social interactions. So those areas of the brain, so to increase social interactions or social communication. There is no harm in this, and some studies have found mild effects on social initiation. So children initiating more interaction with others. Acupuncture for autism is generally just done on the scalp, and again is harmless, and some studies have shown increased social interactions, though some studies have not. Melatonin is used, I know, by many of the parents that I talk to. It is very effective for sleep problems. Indeed, it's thought that many children with autism have decreased natural levels of melatonin. And so you're simply replacing what's naturally there if you give them melatonin. And of course, you know, this is not necessarily working directly on social communication or anything else like that, but with better sleep, you know, we all do better with better sleep, and many children can focus much better. Children with autism can focus much better and have fewer meltdowns. I'm going too slowly here, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. Music therapy can provide an opportunity for children who like music to get together in groups and thus interact more with others, although this doesn't generally generalize outside that therapy setting. Several studies have used children's special interests, so robotics or math or history, things like that, to promote social interactions. But the evidence for this is not very strong, but certainly involving your child, particularly older children, in things like robotics club or math club can increase their opportunities to find like-minded friends, and that's a really good thing. Omega-3 has some evidence for increased social interaction, but more research needs to be done. Sensory integration is used by many OTs or occupational therapists and includes things like weighted vests or blankets, fidget toys. This definitely helps calm and focus some children with autism. Many parents swear by a gluten-free and casein-free diet, and there's little evidence to support these diets, but many, as we know, many children with autism do have gastrointestinal issues, and certainly we all behave better when we're feeling better. So just make sure they're getting all their nutrients, and that may be helpful. Animal-assisted therapy may calm your child and give them more social interaction opportunities, but unfortunately they have little good evidence. Oxytocin is a naturally occurring hormone which increases feeling of social connectedness, but the research on this is very, very mixed. It is not harmful though. The last two are the only two which I would strongly not recommend, and there's absolutely no good evidence for either of them, and they can actually both cause the death of your child. So please avoid these at all costs. So I'll talk about future directions here, and I will go through this relatively quickly so we have lots of time for questions. So there's extremely little intervention research that looks at what particular programs work for which children, at what age, and the mechanisms of how they work. Dr. Georgiadis has written quite a lot about this. Part of this is because researchers tend to feel very strongly about the program that they prefer, and so they don't want to randomly assign somebody to another program. But unfortunately, we have to do this. We have to have more of these studies on a large scale basis so we can understand these questions and begin to answer the questions of what factors like age and IQ, support needs, autism presentation, and other child and family variables predict success in these interventions. Another really important thing to consider is the instruments that we use to assess outcome. Although social communication is the core element that's worked on in NDBIs, we have very few measures that have been validated to assess change that are sensitive enough to measure change across relatively short periods of time of an intervention. Those few measures that we do have should be agreed upon across the research community and used as what we call common data elements. That is, the same outcome measure should be used across all studies as much as possible to ensure that we can compare across studies. ABA tended to focus on changes in IQ when they were assessing progress, but this may not be possible for some of our children, and a switch to changes in adaptive behavior or how the child functions in their daily environment may be much more relevant. We need more randomized control studies that compare across interventions, and we need them to use assessors who are blind to which treatment the child received. Almost every study out there on interventions in autism is somewhat questionable because they do not use blind assessors. Usually they use the parents or the clinicians that provided the intervention, and that's going to pick up on the placebo effect. So we need to focus more on our higher needs children and those with lower IQs. They often don't respond to NDBIs very well. So we need to do figure out what we can do to effectively help them. And finally, we need more longer term follow-up studies. Many of these interventions are relatively short and so may not show much change right as the child is finishing the intervention, but if they're changing the way that parents and children interact, they should show more change across time. So that is it for my presentation today. If you have any questions, remember to post them in the Q&A function. If you have a question which you don't want the whole group to see, please feel free to email me at the following email address. And thanks so much for your attendance and for listening.
Thank you, Beth. That was really interesting. So we have a couple of questions popping in. So I will kind of start with the first one and go in order, and we can have others kind of continue on. Great timing, by the way. We have just enough time. So the first question is really more of a nice little comment. So we have an autistic individual who has moved to Montreal. They are learning French by going to church in French and listening to French. So learning only works in context. They are learning French in a sort of NDBI way, which I think is kind of nice and appropriate.
Yeah, absolutely. I've often thought that I wanted to move to Montreal for a few months so I could really learn French, because didn't learn it very well in school.
Fair. It's been a while. All my French is forgotten.
Mm.
So our next question, I'll just mark that question as answered. The next question here, is CERTS available in Ontario? And if so, can we obtain a list of trusted therapists by region?
Yes, it is available in Ontario. I don't know all the therapists in Ontario, unfortunately, so I couldn't give you a list of trusted therapists. I know that Autism Ontario has a list of the different providers for the different programs on their website. So I would strongly recommend that you go to them. To be able to engage in CERTS, you have to go through a pretty intense training process. So I think that you should be okay. It's definitely it is a good program, and yeah, it really depends on where you live. I know that in Toronto, almost all of the programs that are available in Ontario are available once you get assigned to them. But unfortunately, in rural areas, you may not have a choice of what program you get, because there's only one provider in the area and they only do one type of program. But I think all of the programs that Ontario has approved do have evidence behind them. The four that I mentioned here are the most well-known and have the most evidence, but the other two that are available, Project Impact, and I'm totally blanking on the sixth one, do have evidence for them as well. So don't feel like you're not getting the right program if you get one of those.
All right, thank you. So the next question actually has, I think, two questions within it. So I'm going to split it up into kind of the separate components here. When is the right time to introduce daycare to teach social skills? And is that a good option?
Yes, absolutely. It's a good option. I think it's really important, for children to learn from their peers, as well as from caregivers and clinicians and so forth, their family members. It depends on the child. So some children may need support in daycare, and so may not be able to effectively work in a daycare or thrive in a daycare setting without that support. And you wouldn't get any support probably unless you paid for it yourself or did it yourself without a diagnosis. But I do recommend, for children that are waiting for a diagnosis or waiting for services that don't have high support needs, have lower support needs, that they get into daycare as soon as possible. Yeah.
Wonderful. And then sort of the secondary question was, and I think this is a fascinating one, what developmental trajectory needs to be seen by a parent? As a parent, there's always a question of how much is enough and what signs would help to make decisions for further intervention.
That's
not an easy question, I know.
That's a really I could talk on that probably for hours. I think, is the whole point of these early interventions is that you want to get your child to the point where they sort of can learn from other people, and they find other people interesting enough to learn from. And so, oftentimes what happens is you do early intervention, or you do the early school years programs, and then you think, well, my child's doing really well. And then adolescence hits, and social relationships become so much more complex, particularly for girls, but also for boys, in terms of, just the subtleties of how kids interact, and the communication and all the nonverbal stuff that they have to learn, and sarcasm and irony and all those things, that oftentimes parents choose to enroll their child in a social skills program in early adolescence. And I think, if your child's struggling at all, that's a good idea. But really, it's got to be, every parent is comfortable with different things. And I think, it's really up to the individual family, what they feel comfortable with, what they, how far they want to push their child, how much they, if the child really doesn't enjoy the intervention, maybe you want to try something else if you can. Because not a lot of parents feel good about dragging their child kicking and screaming to an intervention. That's one of the things about parent-mediated interventions that can be really tough. I remember a friend of mine saying, she was doing that pivotal response training with her child, and she said, sometimes I just want to be a parent. I just want to love and hug my kid, and not worry about what I'm reinforcing and what I'm rewarding and that kind of thing. So it's really, it's really what families feel comfortable with, I think is the short answer. But I'm happy to, chat more about this. If you want to shoot me an email, I'm happy to chat more.
All right, great. So at this point, that is sort of the end of our currently submitted questions. So
I just one pop up.
no, it was just a thank you actually to your last answer. So wonderful. Maybe we'll give it a few more seconds for any other kind of questions to percolate. We have a couple minutes left, Beth. So if there is something that you wanted to maybe include in your presentation, but felt you didn't have enough time, or you want to kind of tack on now, we've got the time before we wrap up. So maybe anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think this idea of I think parents often get lost in what they should be doing for their child, and it creates a lot of stress. And so I think, keep in mind that if you are very stressed, that's going to affect your child negatively. So try to get as much social support as you can. I know it's very difficult for people who don't have a child with autism to understand what you're going through. Autism Ontario has wonderful programs, wonderful things on their website to engage with other families and get information and all kinds of things. So I think that that's really a good resource. Of course, it's only available to people in Ontario, but I think there are parent support webs. As far as I know, there are parent support groups like Autism Ontario in every province. I don't know about the territories, but in every province. So, you know, if you are feeling overwhelmed, I would strongly suggest you turn to them for help.
Right. Thank you, Beth. The importance of self-care as well here.
Absolutely.
As you take a drink and ease your frog in the throat. I think I passed it on to you through the Zoom screen somehow. Wonderful. So no further questions have popped up. So thank you to everybody who did submit a question. Thank you to everybody who joined us to listen to this presentation. We really appreciate it.